Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 375, Bat Mitzvah's 100th birthday. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here in the Omer. That's the period between Passover and Shavuot. It's a 7-week period. And we have traditionally on Judaism Unbound taken this 7 weeks to explore a topic. Sometimes it's a topic that allows us to, as we approach Shavuot, which we can think of as that moment that's seen as the foundational moment of Judaism, but that we reenact year after year, that we have seen on Judaism Unbound as an opportunity to reform Judaism each and every year. And this year, we are taking on the subject of the B Mitzvah, that rite of passage ceremony that traditionally marks the beginning of Jewish adulthood and that takes place at the age of 12 or 13. Last year marked the 100th anniversary of the very first Bat Mitzvah in the United States. The first person to ever have a Bat Mitzvah in America was named Judith Kaplan. We are excited to explore the topic of the Jewish innovation that was the Bat Mitzvah 100 years ago over the next few weeks, and also some of the reverberations of that very first Bat Mitzvah today, or that have happened in the 100 years between then and now, with this institution of what we have been calling the B Mitzvah, which is a gender-neutral way to talk about this ceremony. Our guests today are two historians who are respectively the CEO and the chair of the board of the Jewish Women's Archive. If you'll remember, Judith Rosenbaum, who's the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, is a returning guest. She was our guest on Judaism Unbound, episode 238, when we were doing our series on feminism. That makes a lot of sense because the mission of the Jewish Women's Archive is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire them to be agents of change. The Jewish Women's Archive was one of the driving forces behind the celebration of the 100th birthday of the Bat Mitzvah. Its partner in that project is SAJ, which is a synagogue in New York City that was the location of that very first Bat Mitzvah. So we are excited to jump into this conversation about how it all happened and what it all means. Before we do, just a reminder to folks that this is the week when, if you go to judaismunbound.com/classes, you will find 9 different classes that you can register for to take during this Omer period. 4 of the classes have already started, but because this is the Unyeshiva, all the classes are recorded and they are meant to be accessible to you in whatever way you need them to be accessible. You can still register for them even though they've already started, because you can just catch up on the first class with the video, and then you can join the other 2 classes live. So if you want to do that, just head over to judaismunbound.com/classes and sign up for those classes that have already started. But when you get there, you will also see that there are 5 new classes that we have opened registration for, and they're going to be taking place beginning in about 2 weeks from now. And so you can register for those classes and you won't have missed anything. So now let's jump into our conversation about the Bat Mitzvah at 100. Our guests today are Judith Rosenbaum, the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, and Carole Balin, who is the board chair of the Jewish Women's Archive, and both our guests are historians. Judith Rosenbaum has a PhD in American Studies from Brown University and many academic credentials and experiences to her name, in addition to her work leading this incredible organization, the Jewish Women's Archive. Carole Balin, in addition to being the chair of the board of the Jewish Women's Archive, is Professor Emerita of History at her alma mater for rabbinical school, the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where she was the first woman at the New York campus to earn tenure. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia University. Carole Balin is currently writing a book about Bat Mitzvah, anchored in the stories of the pioneering girls who sparked a gender revolution in Jewish life. We are so excited to be launching this series, and especially excited to be launching the series with two eminent historians. So Judith Rosenbaum, welcome back to Judaism Unbound, and Carole, Balin, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you.
Nice to be
Glad
here.
to be here.
So I don't know if we know, maybe you do know, who was the first bar mitzvah in the history of American Judaism, but we do know who the first bat mitzvah was. What's the story of that first bat mitzvah that we should all know about?
So the first bat mitzvah in America belongs to Judith Kaplan. Her father, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, said that he established bat mitzvah for 4 reasons, the first of which was his eldest daughter, Judith, and the other 3 being his younger 3 daughters. Mordechai Kaplan, beginning in 1918, we know, was preaching about suffrage for women in the United States. He was interested in bringing out the best in Judaism and wedding that to the best in democracy in America. At his original pulpit at the Jewish Center, he actually preached about giving women the vote. He longed for mixed seating, that is, women and men to sit together during services. That did not materialize at his first congregation, the Jewish Center, but it did when he established in 1922 the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. And from that, within a couple months of establishing the SAJ, or the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, he basically told his oldest daughter, one of these days, Judith, I'd like you to become bas mitzvah at a Shabbos. They only had Shabbos services on Saturday mornings at that time. So she had a Saturday morning bas mitzvah, what they would have called bas mitzvah with the Ashkenazi pronunciation instead of that hard T of the Sephardic pronunciation. And on Saturday morning, March 18th, 1922, she talked about years later walking to the synagogue with her parents, her 3 sisters, and her 2 grandmothers who vehemently disapproved of this newfangled ritual. And that morning, she had to sit in the front room. This was a brand new makeshift sanctuary whereby the front of this 2-part room was devoted to the prayer service where men sat only, and in the back, women and men could sit together. Judith was forced to sit in the front with all the men. She kind of was cringy about it. As far as she was concerned, her father summoned her to the bima. She did not go, as far as we know, up the stairs to the bima or platform, but rather stood at the base of it after the Torah had already been read by her father. He read the weekly Torah portion, and she read a special portion that her father had chosen for her the night before. She knew nothing until the night before of what she would be reading. She was summoned to his study on Friday night after Shabbos dinner, and he showed her the portion he wanted to read, which was from the book of Leviticus, happened to be in the Torah portion. The cycle was up to Exodus, but he chose from the Holiness Code, and she recited the brachas, the blessings in Hebrew, before and after her reading, the standard prayers that are said before an aliyah or being called to the Torah. And then she repeated in Hebrew and English from her own Bible, a handheld Bible, not the Torah itself, the portion that her father had chosen. And as she says, no lightning struck, no thunder sounded. Bat mitzvah had been inaugurated in the United States. That's the first one.
The lightning would have been a nice touch, though. I do think that a lightning
Wouldn't
strike
it?
would have been. That's like, some people have the chocolate fountains. This would be a nice one.
Yeah. Love that. Instead of that, that baked Alaska comes out with the fire, the torches.
Right,
So yes, It would have been nice to see that at that sanctuary.
2 questions. One, is it right to kind of understand, because it took me a while to fully understand Mordechai Kaplan in this regard, that in this period, in 1922, he was more or less what we would think of today as a kind of very liberal Orthodox rabbi, kind of coming at this from a direction so that it would be really surprising for a girl to have a bat mitzvah at that time. And I guess I'm wondering, related to that, why did this not happen in the Reform movement, which had long existed, or in the conservative movement, which a version of it had existed for a while? Why was this only in this kind of newfangled thing that eventually becomes Reconstructionism, but at the time was more Orthodox-ish?
Right. It's a great question. People assume that it was the Reform movement, the most liberal at that time of the movements in America, to establish anything that had to do with egalitarianism or something that seemed a little bit more progressive. But in fact, that is, as you say, not the way it went. Mordecai Kaplan at the time, and for 60 years, was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the flagship of the conservative movement. You could have, I think at the time, the 20s for sure, and by the 30s, you could have imagined him as being sort of on the left wing, the progressive wing of the conservative movement. And he, of course, will go on to found what's known as Reconstructionist Judaism, which has as at its heart egalitarianism among men and women, or between men and women. But in terms of the reform movement, they had jettisoned bar mitzvah. In Germany, the very early reformers, who didn't call themselves reform at the time, liberals, had adopted confirmation based on the Protestant model, whereby girls and boys together had a group ceremony. It started around the age of 13, later on shifted to about 15 years old. And that was brought to America when the reform movement took root here in this country in the mid-19th century. It was confirmation that reform rabbis adopted. And only much later did they return to, I should say, bar mitzvah, and then alongside it came bat mitzvah. And that happened, the late 50s into the 60s. We can talk about who was adopting when and where, if you'd like.
Amazing. So sticky noting that I'm really, really interested in the confirmation bat mitzvah set of historical realities. We had a great presentation from Laura Yeris last year on Shavuot. I'm going to put it in the show notes for this episode, all about confirmation and its early history in the 19th century and early 20th. But for now, I do want to live in bat mitzvah land. And I want to do our first of many time jumps. I hope this episode can have some historical pieces and some today pieces, but I don't want them to be totally separate from each other. I want to hop back and forth. And so, Judith, I wanted to go to you and get a sense of, okay, so 100 years ago, we had a ritual happen at a synagogue in New York. Judy Kaplan did a set of unprecedented, at least in America, things. And 100 years later, what called JWA to mark this 100th year celebration? And what did you create?
When we were looking towards, we're always noting different anniversaries that are happening, and not from the sort of boring sense of like, okay, it's been this many years since this happened, and so let's mark it and celebrate, and that's all. But I think what was particularly interesting to us about Bat Mitzvah is that it really gave us an opportunity to celebrate this anniversary in the way that we like to do history, which is as inaugurating a process of change, and a process of change that isn't finished. And that's really why I think history is exciting and important, is that it's not just like, okay, this thing happened a long time ago and it changed things, but it's really thinking about like, how does change happen? And also to recognize that change doesn't happen usually as like, it turns on and then it turns off, right? Like, and even in the case of Judith Kaplan, she had her bat mitzvah, but it's not like then after that, the floodgates were open and okay, bat mitzvah was now a thing and every girl got a bat mitzvah. It was like, it didn't happen again for a while. It didn't even happen again at SAJ for a while. So it seemed like a very interesting opportunity, both from our perspective 100 years later of saying we look back over the 20th century and early 21st century, and some of the most significant changes that we can see in Jewish life have to do with the inclusion of women and the impact that women have made in public Jewish life. And so looking at the moments where there were shifts that happened, where there were openings that began that process, was an exciting possibility. It also happened that this anniversary was happening around the same time as we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of women in the rabbinate in America. So it was very interesting to think about, okay, so that change happened 50 years beforehand, and is there a relationship between those two? And we were particularly excited because it feels like this is very much an unfinished revolution. It's a revolution that has been so significant that most, not just young people, but most Jews probably didn't realize that bat mitzvah was new. And in fact, young people, particularly when I would talk to them about bat mitzvah, would sort of had this idea that girls were having bat mitzvahs hundreds of years ago. So it had taken root in this really deep way, but also that there's like constant change and rethinking about what does bat mitzvah look like? What does coming of age look like in a Jewish context? And how do we think about the gender component of it too? How do we think about that now in a time when we are not wedded to a gender binary? And how do we explore all of that? But also, how do we think about inclusion more broadly? And one of the things I think is like the ongoing gift of feminism is that it opens some of those questions and then helps us to think, once we're thinking about, oh, what happens once we invite women up onto the bima, it also makes us notice who else isn't here or is not invited up and who else has been excluded. And so then that leads to all kinds of interesting questions and opportunities, rethinking what ritual looks like, what leadership looks like in the Jewish community.
I think it's important to add that in many ways, these girls become the role models for their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers. The girls paved the way to female presence on the bima. Before then, we didn't have grown women reading Torah at the most, or even opening an ark or so. So little by little, the perception begins to change about what females can do. And in fact, SAJ becomes a test case for that, where post bat mitzvah girls will rally, for example, to carry the Torah on Simchat Torah, the holiday that celebrates the end of the Torah into the beginning. And they'll win that battle at SAJ. Over and over, that will happen in various congregations. You imagine these mothers sitting in the congregation saying, hey, look at her, we can do this. And in fact, it leads to women fulfilling leadership roles in synagogues, whether it be on the board or, in ritual life for sure. After all, bar mitzvah really is a gateway to Jewish life. A boy is called up to the Torah for the first time when he's 13, whether he reads Torah or has an aliyah, he will continue to do that for the rest of his life. Bat mitzvah was originally...
Theoretically. But the opportunity is open to him, at least.
Exactly. And the expectation in most cases is open to him. Whereas, right, for the girl, Judith, it means that, it's a dead end. She gets educated to a certain point, but she doesn't get to use it again. It's one and done. And that starts to change over time. And it takes time. It happens in fits and starts.
One of the things that was most moving to me in our celebration of this 100th anniversary was all of the stories that we heard, both some that we collected at JWA and also the stories that I heard as I was out and about speaking about Bat Mitzvah. And just seeing the pride that people had in being first. And it's one of the nice things about, celebrating something like the Bat Mitzvah. There's the first of Judith Kaplan, but then there's the first in every community. The first girl to have a Bat Mitzvah in that synagogue, the first girl to have a Bat Mitzvah on a Saturday, the first girl to get to read Torah as part of a Bat Mitzvah, sort of all these different firsts. And the people had so much pride in those moments. And for me, it actually it really helped me even appreciate Bat Mitzvah more. I mean, I think I came of age in the 80s. So Bat Mitzvah by that point was fairly standard, at least in my community, already pretty ostentatious, not necessarily in my community, but overall, I would say. And and Bat Mitzvah has a kind of bad rap, right? It's sort of when you see popular cultural representations, what people want to talk about are the parties and the dresses. And there's very little about what it actually means to people. And I heard so many stories about people who had really had to advocate for having a Bat Mitzvah, whether it was, a girl whose family didn't belong to a synagogue, but she felt like she saw other kids doing Bat Mitzvah. And she's like, maybe this is my way to connect. And she actually got with another friend of hers, they got their mothers to try to find a rabbi who would do a Bat Mitzvah for them. And that led to her kind of self-discovery of her own Jewish path. And I heard a story from 2021 of a grandmother who decided when her grandson was being bar mitzvah, this was her opportunity to finally have the bat mitzvah she never got to have. And so she decided to train alongside her grandson. And I heard many stories like this, actually, of multiple generations having benot mitzvah at the same time because of those kinds of familial opportunities. And just so sort of seeing that ongoing process of advocacy and of meaning making and of figuring out, how do I do this in a way that is going to work for me and my family. It was just very moving and such a nice counterpoint to, I think, a lot of the stereotypes that we see in popular culture. And also just a reminder of on the one hand, there's something sweet about the fact that so many people have no idea that bat mitzvah is a relatively new thing, right? It's great that all these young people are growing up just assuming that girls always had this possibility, that this was always an opportunity open to them. And it's nice to think that that's always been true, and how great that kids grow up with a sense that access was always possible. But if we forget that change happened to make this possible, then we forget how change happens. And it makes invisible the ways that change is constantly happening. And that's a really important piece of what it is to be engaged in Jewish life.
I really appreciate what you're saying about the pop culture stereotypes. I actually had this weird moment last year where I don't know what was possessing me that day. I decided I was going to make a project for myself and watch as many B Mitzvah episodes of television shows as I could find. I was surprised by how good I thought some of them were, especially some of the recent ones. And so I'm going to put in the show notes some links. There are a ton of trash ones. And there's this show, The Ghost and Molly McGee on Disney Channel, which I think was one of the most recent Bat Mitzvah episodes. I was incredibly impressed with what they did with it.
I haven't seen that one, but I think the one from the Big Mouth one was pretty good too.
Yeah, Big Mouth, another animated, although not so much a kid's show, or at least,
right.
yeah.
Depends on your kid.
Nick Kroll, not known for his kids' media. But I do want to nerd out a little and get into some of the fits and starts that you alluded to for that next period in the history of Bat Mitzvah. And as I said before, feel free to mix and match historical pieces and today pieces. But, 1922, our first American Bat Mitzvah. We haven't quite said this explicitly, but there were earlier ones in Europe. And I think that's important to say. We have a lot of listeners in other areas of the world, and we get frequent emails about how we're very American-centric, which is definitely true. But I'm a little curious about the prehistory of this in Europe. And let's nerd out and get into the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, those decades where Bat Mitzvah did start to become more common. What were the fits? What were the starts? Where did Bat Mitzvah catch on in the biggest ways? What was that next stage of development of the Bat Mitzvah?
Bat Mitzvah did not originate in the United States. It took its precedence from Europe. There were traditional communities, especially in Italy, that we know of. In Italy, France, and maybe the Ottoman Empire, where girls celebrated their coming of age in some way, whether it was dressing in new clothing and saying the Shechianu, the blessing of beginnings, or in Turin, Italy, being called up to the bima on a weekday where the rabbi would bless them. The girls wore white wreaths in their hair. We do know of some precedents, but it didn't take on as a movement kind of thing the way it did in the United States until Judith. But even with Judith, we know it came in fits and starts.
Kaplan, not Rosenbaum, just because we've got a Judith in the room.
So Judith was in 1922. It's important to say explicitly that was 2 years after women got the vote. Many women in the United States got the vote, not all women, as we know from later history. But those first mainly happened at SAJ when each Kaplan girl came of age, she became Bat Mitzvah. And then sort of her cohort became alongside her. In fact, the youngest daughter became Bat Mitzvah with another person, with another girl, who wrote her memoirs about it. And we know what happened and how Selma was the youngest daughter, and she became Bat Mitzvah with another girl. And they made an agreement beforehand that Selma would go first and the other girl would go second. Felicia Lamport was her name. Felicia would go second. And if Selma made a mistake, Felicia promised to make a mistake as well so that Selma wouldn't be embarrassed since she was the rabbi's daughter. And, this whole phenomenon, too, about, who instigates the bat mitzvah ceremony, the bat mitzvah first in a community. It could have been the girl. In many cases it is. And sometimes it's a grandfather. And many times it's a father who's a rabbi who only has daughters. In Atlanta, Rabbi Harry Epstein, he only had 2 daughters. In Atlanta, it started to catch on like wildfire, which kind of is what happened with Bat Mitzvah. It would sort of land in a city and other rabbis would sort of, notice what was going on. When it took place on a Friday night, it usually meant that the attendance rates went up and other rabbis got onto the Bat Mitzvah bandwagon. And sure enough, so in Atlanta, Harry Epstein's daughter becomes Bat Mitzvah in the 1940s, early 1940s. Within years, 6 rabbis in Atlanta have introduced Bat Mitzvah. This is in the 1940s. And the rabbis worry about the ostentation and sort of what they've seen in terms of the celebrations of bar mitzvah boy parents. So they create a menu, a standard menu that should be used at every bat mitzvah, at the Oneg Shabbat, at the reception after Shabbat services. And it includes ragalah, those rolled pastries, kichel, the crackers, tea, and bottles of Coca-Cola in Atlanta. It's signature beverage. In glass bottles with straws, they even specify, because that's a polite way to sip your soda. So we start to see it developing in the 40s. But let me back up for a minute. In 1931, for instance, we know that a survey was taken of conservative rabbis. 120 responded to the survey. Only 6 had introduced bat mitzvah in 1931, and many had never heard of it. It starts to gel in certain places in the 30s, primarily at summer camps, where it's looser, it's more outdoorsy. you're away from the limitations of a standard congregational service. And girls become bat mitzvah at Camp Sedgwick in Port Jervis, New York, and also Camp Moden, which still exists in Maine. There's a story of a girl, Kinneret Dushkin. Later on, she becomes a Gensler. She becomes a poet later in her life, a published poet. She teaches at Radcliffe, and she wrote a poem about her bat mitzvah that was not to be at Camp Moden, where her parents were the directors. She was supposed to have the first bat mitzvah ever. She was longing to do it, pining, you'll excuse the pun, to take the Torah out of their Torah tree, which had birch-covered doors. She was going to use the yad, the finger pointer that boys use. She was longing to do this. And sure enough, she practiced, and she was great at Hebrew. She had lived half the year in Jerusalem, where her father was a professor at a girls' high school. And she got a period that week, and she was not allowed to read from the Torah. And she writes about this in her poetry years later. It's heartbreaking. I don't think she's alone. But it shows kind of the desire, the longing on the part of these girls who Shabbat after Shabbat would see the boys go up at a summer camp setting of all places and wanted to do it. She did, have some sort of ceremony, but she was not allowed to touch that Torah and use that yad.
One of the stories that we got in our story collecting at JWA about bat mitzvah was from a girl who also ended up having her bat mitzvah at camp unexpectedly. She was supposed to have it in the fall when she returned to her family's congregation. And over the summer, the rabbi left and a new rabbi came in. And the parents figured out pretty quickly that this new rabbi, this was, I think, in the 40s, was not going to allow their daughter's bat mitzvah to take place. And so they encouraged her to try to do it while she was at camp. And so she actually ended up doing it with the boy that she was sort of dating at camp. And she said, I'm pretty sure this was the first time that a girl and a boy had a bat mitzvah together. Now, of course, it may not have been, because as we know, and Carole, you've done a ton of research about this, bat mitzvah was happening sort of in a grassroots way in all these different places. And often there's so many conflicting stories of who's first because people didn't necessarily know. But one of the themes that I also really appreciate as the parent of boy-girl twins is how many bat mitzvahs were brought about by the parents of twins who were sort of like, it's a little awkward. Somehow it was more stark to notice if you have boy-girl twins who have been going along the same path, getting the same education, and then suddenly one of them is allowed to have the ceremony and the other isn't. And there were several families where that was the impetus for introducing bat mitzvah.
We do know, too, that girls, even in Orthodox communities, were becoming bat mitzvah already in the 50s. Muriel, later in Euclid, became bat mitzvah at her father's congregation, again, the oldest daughter, no sons, at the Hebrew Educational Alliance in Denver. And she was allowed to give a speech from the bima in the main shul after services on a Friday night. So they start to trickle in by the 60s, certainly by the 70s. By the end of the 50s, I think it is 1/3 of conservative congregations have introduced bat mitzvah. The reformers will catch up, so to speak, in the late 60s and into the 70s.
I don't know how to feel about some of that stuff that you're describing, like the fact that it was a rabbi who only had daughters. Like, part of it feels like, okay, that's good. I mean, that's kind of how change happens, and we should take it when we get it. But it's kind of disappointing about the human condition in the sense that it doesn't seem like these right things are driven by morality and by thoughtful sense of the right thing. It's just like it sort of hits you in the face, and I get that, and I'm glad that, look, a lot of rabbis had only daughters and didn't have bat mitzvahs, so you have to be happy about the ones that did, but there's something about it that feels a little bittersweet to me.
I mean, I think that's human nature. I think people fear the unknown, and as it becomes more familiar to them, they're more willing to sort of take it in. Once these girls stepped into the limelight over and over in various places, the realization hit, hey, why are we limiting this? I think World War II and the Holocaust certainly had a lot to do with the fact that rabbis across the movements wanted to ramp up education for girls. They were concerned about continuity and the Jewish people, themes we hear still today. And they introduced more education for girls, and that led to more and more B'not Mitzvah.
I'm wondering, Judith, if you could talk a little bit about the whole way that you went about marking the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah. Like, how did you decide to do it? What were the components? There are some really interesting things that you created this fake Instagram series of Judy Kaplan, which I loved. And I'm just wondering how you went about that process, but also more broadly, if there are ways that the way that you addressed the 100th anniversary of the first Bat Mitzvah gives us a pathway for how we might educate people more broadly about other things that they should know about.
I think that the celebration happened, it emerged in a kind of grassroots way, much like Bat Mitzvah itself. And then we tried to maintain that impulse. So JWA had been talking about what we were going to do. And it turned out that Rabbi Lauren Graybell Herman at SAJ had also been having lots of conversations about what she wanted to do. And in our various speakings with different people said, you guys have to talk to each other because you're both talking about doing this. And so we were really excited to be able to join together and develop Bat Mitzvah 100 together. And Mick Moore is the person really who was responsible for the Judith Kaplan Instagram, which was fabulous. And we were very excited to be able to be part of that. Our feeling was really that this should be something that was nationally recognized. We didn't want to be the only ones holding it. And so we tried to engage a wide range of partners across the spectrum of Jewish life to sign on to having a national Shabbat that would be recognized in various communities in different ways. But it was really important to us that we provide a wide range of suggestions for how to market, because we felt like just as Bat Mitzvah emerged in different ways and is marked today in very different ways in different congregations, so too should the anniversary be marked in ways that feel organic to that community. So in some communities that might mean, in a community that has a very robust B'nai Mitzvah program, maybe that means inviting up all of the girls who are going to have their Bat Mitzvah this year and having them do something special. In a community that is not really focused on that kind of ritual, maybe it's learning about Bat Mitzvah. Maybe it's doing study sessions about this. In communities that are liturgically open and experimental, maybe it's trying some new ritual and liturgy. We really wanted people to weave it in the ways that were going to be meaningful for them and that were going to resonate with their communities. And we recognize that for some, it might mean celebrating history. It might mean inviting back the firsts in the community who had, maybe not even Bat Mitzvah, maybe the first woman who had been president of the synagogue, and sort of recognizing that this is part of a larger story about women taking on public leadership role within religious institutions. Or maybe it was an opportunity to talk about how are we thinking about inclusion in our synagogue and on the Bima today, and beginning or continuing conversations about B Mitzvah or about
B Mitzvah being a coming of age ceremony for non-binary 12 or 13-year-olds.
How do we make sure that kids with disabilities are able to participate in B'nai Mitzvah programs? So we developed a whole bunch of different resources to make that possible. Some curricular pieces, some liturgical pieces, some great videos with some of the history and learning that Carole did. We tried to pull together a lot of the archival material on our site, both historical and sort of more contemporary reflections on Bat Mitzvah and Bat Mitzvah experiences. We did a podcast episode that talked about history, and we really tried to put all of that out there as a kind of abundance of resources that would encourage communities to dip in their own ways. And we saw lots of really great things at different synagogues. Some synagogues collected pictures of Bat Mitzvahs through the ages and made poster boards that they put up in the front of the shul. We certainly saw a lot of that happening sort of naturally on social media. And that was a really fun thing to see people posting their pictures and in a very sweet way, not only to make fun of their hairstyles and dress choices, but really with a sense of pride and of celebration, like really appreciating this moment to acknowledge being part of this larger story of historical change.
So as we release this episode, I rarely mention the Torah portion that is happening when a particular episode comes out, but I feel called to today because in the Torah portion that aligns with this week that this episode's coming out, there's actually one of the most explicit, there's a lot of explicit instances of sexism in the Torah, but there's a really explicit instance of sexism that I think gets talked about less than some others. This was brought up in me by the reference to a girl who was going to have a bat mitzvah, but then because she had her period, she wasn't able to have the bat mitzvah. In this week's Torah portion, we're in Leviticus in Tazria Mitzorah, and we learn that when a girl is born, the mother is impure ritually for twice as long as the mother is impure after giving birth to a boy. There's this idea that when giving birth, there is an impurity that comes with that. There's a lot to unpack with that on its own. But even if you take that as a given, a girl birth leads to twice as much impurity for the mother. And we don't talk about that much for a few reasons, because it's an uncomfortable text, and I do think it's sexist. I also think that because it relates to biological birth and it is in the context of like skin diseases and fluids and all, like we don't want to have those conversations in Jewish life. But when we don't have them, then I think that's what can lead to a situation like you described, where the fact of somebody having a period, which, billions of people around the world have every month, the idea that could lead to somebody being ineligible to have a ritual that they've worked hard on, that they've poured their souls into, to think that it's somehow better to ban them from it. I have to imagine that girl felt really alienated and upset with Jewish tradition at that point. So I guess I did want to back out for a second and ask a bigger question about the legacy of sexism in our Jewish tradition, going back not just the last 100 years, but before that. How do we use this 100th anniversary of the Bat Mitzvah, not just, to do amazing things with Bat Mitzvah, with B Mitzvah, but how can we also take this as a moment to check in more broadly about upending the sexism that continues in our tradition beyond just Bat Mitzvah?
It's a really good question, and it's not a simple question. I think it depends if you're sort of looking back or looking forward, right? Like if you're looking back, I don't know what the answer is for that in terms of like how do we, I think it's a bigger question about how do we eradicate a lot of the baked in patriarchy that may not even be visible to us as such. And also a lot of the things like the fear of menstruation that are actually, they're sort of extra legal. They're more about cooties than they are about tradition, right? And I was just looking back today at some of the stories that we collected around Bat Mitzvah, and there was one beautiful but painful one from a woman who actually had an adult Bat Mitzvah, and even as an adult was so paralyzed by what she thought her father, who had been raised as a chassid and had left ultra-Orthodoxy, but had held on to certain notions, what he was long dead, but what he would have thought about her being at the Torah and touching the Torah, and that actually was so paralyzing that she wasn't sure she was going to be able to go through with her Bat Mitzvah. So I think that sort of gives us a sense of how deeply rooted these things can be sometimes, that we can't even, they're so emotional that it's very hard to figure out how you unlearn them. I think in a more kind of forward-looking sense, it's exactly about this piece of saying, celebrating this anniversary is not just about Bat Mitzvah. It's about looking at how change is made in who is given a voice and who is given a role in public leadership and what impact that has. And, for example, making that connection between what's happening in secular society that opens up the idea that maybe if women are going to vote, they also should be able to vote in the synagogue. And then that means maybe they actually are going to have to be allowed to be synagogue members and be allowed to be on the board. And all of those kinds of things are happening through the 19 teens and 20s, following women and men from the, secular conversations right in the door of the synagogue. It's not just important because, so now women can sit on the bima next to men or can be presidents of their synagogue or can read from the Torah. It's that once you include a wider range of people in Jewish life, Judaism is enriched with the perspectives and experiences of a wider range of people, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just that there's a value to women getting to learn how to read from the Torah. It's that once they read from the Torah, they also share their perspective on the Torah. And then that becomes part of Torah, right? That is how we continue to generate Torah, is by continually interpreting and engaging with the text. And you can't do that if you are not allowed to engage with the text. And this is one way that kind of engagement happens. That's part of what's most inspiring about the story of Bat Mitzvah, is looking at actually, so Mordechai Kaplan opened the door and he lets Judith come in, not all the way up onto the bima, right? As Carole mentioned in the story of Judith Kaplan, she doesn't actually read from the Torah on the bima, she reads below it. But he opens the door to that possibility. But what really makes it possible for there to be a larger change is that girls ask the question, like, wait, if I'm being allowed to train to do this once, why can't I do it again? Right. And we know that there are girls at SAJ who, in fact, say that several years later, who are like, if I'm allowed to learn how to read Torah, why can't I do it again? And what is the purpose of you teaching me this? Or you have girls, Sally Gottesman in the 1970s, she's going to have a bat mitzvah at her synagogue in New Jersey, where girls are not allowed to have a Saturday morning bat mitzvah. And she writes a letter to the ritual committee of her synagogue and says, I have learned everything alongside boys in the synagogue, and I know as much as they know. So why shouldn't I be allowed to have this? And then her mother also writes a letter and says, by the way, I have other daughters, and these girls are not going to back down. And so you can say she can do it or not do it, but I can assure you my kids are going to do it. And so either it's going to happen here or it's going to happen somewhere else. That's the lesson of Bat Mitzvah, is when you become when you become an adult Jewishly and you become a member of a congregation, you are responsible for speaking up and shaping what happens in that congregation. And that's what we're inviting kids into, is the opportunity to be a voice and make an impact. It's not about celebrating that they've arrived at this moment. It's a little bit maybe about celebrating what they've learned, but it's really about welcoming them into engaging in this real way. And these girls engaged. They said, well, thank you for this, but maybe not enough. Or how about maybe we get to do this too? Or maybe it should happen in this way. And that's the lesson, I think, of Bat Mitzvah, not whatever happened on the Bima.
I love the idea too that, right, it's only 100 years old, which is a blink of an eye, right, in Jewish history. So it's something that you can actually tabulate. It feels very, very real, especially the fact that, and it's such a lovely coincidence of history, that the 100th anniversary of Bat Mitzvah took place the same year as the 50th anniversary of the first American woman rabbi. And when you look at sort of that 50 years, those 5 decades, what happens from Judith Kaplan to Sally Prisan, who's the first woman ordained by an institution in this country, by a rabbinical seminary, it's remarkable to see that difference. Kinneret Gensler, the woman who wasn't allowed to read Torah, the girl who was not allowed to read Torah at her bat mitzvah at the camp because she got her period, had a healing later on. I want to tell you the end of the story. It is so heartwarming. Kinneret's son married a woman who became a rabbi, Bonnie Steinberg. Bonnie was pregnant with her first child, and Kinneret came for Yom Kippur that year to Bonnie's congregation, to Kinneret's son and her daughter-in-law, Bonnie. And in the afternoon switch between the morning Torah reading of Yom Kippur and the afternoon Torah reading, Bonnie, who was like 5 or 6 months pregnant, had to roll the Torah. And she asked Kinneret if she would help her. And Kinneret said, okay. Now, Kinneret could read Hebrew. She was fluent in Hebrew, but she had never read the Torah, even back from, when she lost the chance in 1934. By this time, she's in her mid to late 70s. And they're rolling the Torah, and Kinneret is feeling the parchment in her own fingers. And she whispers under her breath, and Bonnie hears it. That was a healing. That was a tikkun.
Wow.
And, that you can chart that over the course of a person's lifetime in Jewish history is quite extraordinary and says so much about the changes that have been wrought in just a lifetime. We have a long way to go, but I think what came out in that 100th anniversary celebration, March 18th in 2022, was the possibility and the potential and the power that not just women, but any person who's been marginalized in Jewish life can have. What's really remarkable to me is that it was girls of 12 and 13 who step into the limelight at probably the most awkward stage of their lives and come onto the bima in front of hundreds sometimes of guests, family and friends, and sort of grab hold, at least metaphorically, of the Torah. And these are girls who are usually seen now, in our era, it's different, but in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, girls were seen as sort of innocuous, right? And harmless. And I actually think their innocuity was their superpower. I think they appeared one way, but they were doing something that was different than the perception had been of these girls. That is a tremendous gift for a girl of today, I think, to think about and to see. I don't know if JWA's RVFs, our Rising Voices Fellows, discuss this. These are our high school girls, high school women, young women who are involved with writing exercises and publishing on our blog in a year-long internship. But for that age group, I think understanding the impact that girls of 12 and 13 made on such a patriarchal religion, faith community at that, you can't ask for a better example.
I'm thinking about this question about the pride and excitement of the kind of pioneers who had to create what Bat Mitzvah was going to be for themselves and advocate for it, and how powerful an experience that is compared to something that is just an assumption that everyone's going to do it. And it's kind of, you don't have to invent it for yourself. It already exists. And it's sort of the path of least resistance is just to go through this somewhat maybe tired path that doesn't require a lot of thinking and innovation. But I think one of the interesting questions, and what I think can be exciting about taking the spirit of the Bat Mitzvah revolution and continuing to apply it to new frontiers where we're recognizing that there is not equity or inclusion, it reminds us that like it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be something that is tired and standard. There actually can be more space to invite young people into imagining what that ceremony and milestone could be. And I think harnessing some of that energy, I hope, is also what can come out of this.
There's a couple pieces that are sitting with me on the future-facing front. The B Mitzvah front, the front where when we talk about coming-of-age rituals for Jews, whether 12 or 13 or adults, we are not today talking about either boys or girls, either men or women. We are talking about girls, boys, non-binary folks, men, women, non-binary adults, a full spectrum gender-wise. And it really is a new frontier ritually. That's not to say there has never in the past been trans folks, never been non-binary folks. There absolutely have. But in terms of rituals housed in mainstream institutions or even less mainstream institutions, it's a very new frontier. And so part of me is curious what we can learn from that 100 years ago frontier as we look at that particular frontier. And the other piece that I want to ask, and maybe this is a little delicate, we love synagogues. And also on this show, we spend a lot of time questioning what the limitations are of synagogue life. And as I think about the future of the B Mitzvah, I'm actually also thinking about the past of the B Mitzvah, which you talked about both how there were actually things that were possible at some summer camps that weren't possible in some synagogue contexts. And then there were also limitations at the summer camps. I think in general, this is not 100% the case, but there are spaces of Jewish life that are not synagogues. There might be, Jewish justice organizations, Jewish nonprofits that work with children. There's a lot of content. We're speaking with some of them in this unit. We're going to have great episodes with Camp Tawanga, with Judaism Your Way, really cool organizations. I guess I want to shine a light on how the fact that they're doing cool Bat Mitzvah and B Mitzvah things might be a feature, not a bug. Like the fact that they're not a synagogue and that they are bringing B Mitzvahs to other contexts, outdoors, camps, wherever a given 12 or 13-year-old wants their B Mitzvah to be in some cases. I'm curious how we can think about that in this conversation. So basically, what do we apply to the future of B Mitzvah on the gender front and on the what it even is front?
I love that we're rethinking it. And what I especially love is when it's called B Mitzvah, which is a bet in Hebrew. A bet in Hebrew, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which has the B sound, it means lots of things. It's a preposition. It means in, it can mean on, it can mean by. B Mitzvah. I think of the mitzvah like a surfboard now. And I think about like these kids, they're on the mitzvah, they're beside the mitzvah, they're in the mitzvah. And that to me is a metaphor for this new front. How are these kids going to use a coming of age in a Jewish context to understand themselves as Jews, to understand their sexuality, to understand their gender expression? I have a friend, she was telling me she had a historic bat mitzvah herself, really incredible in the 1970s. And she said to me, I'm so grateful that Judaism offers a coming of age ceremony so that our kids at the time in their lives where they might be starting to think about, who am I, right? About, who am I as a gendered person, as a being, kind of start to maneuver that. It doesn't mean that they have to choose now, right? It means that they're considering it and they're mulling it over in a Jewish context. And the Jewish context doesn't have to be a synagogue. It could be a Jewish overnight camp or in your youth group or, at a mountaintop with your family or in Israel, which we've seen. But I think that's a continuation also of what people have been calling a mitzvah project. That started in around the 1980s or so, where kids would adopt a project that would allow them to act as Jewish adults, to actually give back to the world and do something in the world. That caught on in a lot of places where a kid becomes bar bat mitzvah, B mitzvah, and alongside it, they're doing some kind of social justice work. That's the tip of the iceberg. I see enormous possibility. I am so grateful to the LGBTQ community for opening up the Jewish community these questions.
And there were so many first bat mitzvahs that took place outside of synagogues for obvious reasons. And those, I think, were particularly powerful often because they required not just figuring out what the bat mitzvah looked like, but what the whole thing was going to be, right? There were no rules. Then the whole thing could be reimagined and reinvented. And, and that's a really great opportunity. I mean, my orientation is always like, get out of the building. And if chairs can't be moved around, you're in big trouble. But I think it's also an opportunity to just redefine what even the component parts are. And I mean, I can say personally, this was a process we went through very deeply with my own kids who are twins, one of whom was in day school and had already learned how to read Torah and was super excited about doing that. And one who was a day school dropout and doesn't read Hebrew and was really not psyched about being in, like, we weren't sure he could sit through the service, and what he did was drum. And that was really meaningful for him. It had been something he had done throughout services for much of his childhood. And it didn't have to be the same as his sister. I feel very lucky to belong to a synagogue where that is totally normalized, that there's, you find your way in and that's your way and it is celebrated. And I recognize that's not the norm, but it should be. And I think bat mitzvah and sort of reminding us that, like, you can shake things up. It's an invitation to shake things up in other ways and think about, why does it have to be that you have to be able to read Torah, read Hebrew, stand in the front of the congregation, whatever the things are that can be meaningful for some people and real limitations for others.
I'm wondering, from a historical standpoint, how significant you think the 1920 women's suffrage movement success to get the vote was really on the whole idea of Mordechai Kaplan to do the bat mitzvah. And the reason I ask that is because what's going on in my mind is, like, maybe the impetus for the types of innovations that we're talking about tend not to come from inside the Jewish institutions. And I'm thinking about, like, if you wanted to invest somewhere where the most exciting future, most important changes were going to come from, would you try to get synagogues and JCCs and other big incumbent Jewish institutions, would you get them to try to be more experimental? Or would you kind of see from the work of the Jewish Women's Archive, I think, like, no, really, those changes tend to come outside of those institutions and maybe even outside of Judaism in general. And so that's where we should be looking for the future of inclusion and growth and change.
I tend to think that we can't look only at those mainstream big institutions. I think we do need to figure out how to bring them on board, but I don't think the mainstream is where change generally starts, right? It may be an important driver of implementation or sort of builder of some kind of momentum or something. I do think there's great value to big institutions. And I also think that their downside is that they aren't always places where innovation starts. Also, like, Judaism should be engaged with those questions. It is engaged with those questions in the larger world. And I think we create a false dichotomy if we're sort of like, there's the secular conversation and then there's the Jewish conversation. Like, they're always happening together and they're always influenced by one another. And there isn't an inside and outside in that way. And then I think I'm a big believer that you always have to be looking to the margins to figure out what are the kind of interesting questions that need to be brought into the mainstream. And then you figure out how to do that mix.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation and a great kickoff to what's going to be an awesome, awesome unit of episodes.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation and we hope that you'll tune in for the rest of this unit on Bat Mitzvah. We've got a lot of amazing episodes coming your way. A couple reminders before we fully close out. First, we've got our certificate program. We've got the Anya Shiva's amazing opportunity to have some ongoing Jewish learning and unlearning in your life. Applications for our first cohort in the certificate program close April 30th, so that's coming up very, very soon. Head to JudaismUnbound.com/certificate to submit your basic information form, and then you'll get all the information you need about how you can apply. So that's first things first. Second thing, we have some amazing mini courses coming up that you can sign up for at JudaismUnbound.com/classes. Just head there and you will see our 5 different options beginning in early May. So we hope that you will check out those Unyeshiva possibilities. And with that, we will fully close out by telling you all the ways you can be in touch with us. If you have comments, questions, ideas, visions related to this episode or any other recent ones, we love to hear them. And here are all the different ways that you can be in touch with us. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram feeds. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and many, many others. Third, there is our email addresses. We love when you are in touch with us, and you can hit us up via dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, and you can do that via a monthly recurring gift or on a one-time basis via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.